Wow.
I'm kidding. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about why horror films in general, and I think especially probably over the last 30 or 40 years, are severely overlooked.
Dude, where's the button?
To the point of where, what button?
To lock my seat.
It's like the lever. You got to like pop the lever in.
What do you mean? That's how you lower it.
Yeah, so you like can pop it out and in. So if you push it out, it lets you do this.
What do you mean?
If you push it in towards the chair, it locks it. Oh my gosh.
I would have never.
I think Dom's brain just broke.
Expected this.
Okay.
Were we having a discussion about?
Yeah, we were. I think I just touched your foot. I'm sorry. Again, if you touch my foot, I will get scared. And I will think that something is trying to grab me from underneath.
Thinking too much about horror movies.
Well, yeah, this is what happens. I'm still listen.
It's spooky season.
Listen, we talked in our little intro or intermission last week about how I didn't watch horror until I was older.
Yeah.
Because I was a scaredy cat. That hasn't changed. What has changed is my tolerance in the moment is better, but then it gets over and I'm like, I gotta sleep with the lights on.
Yeah.
I've watched a good couple movies in the 5 years that I've started watching horror where I'm like, I might have to sleep with the lights on now.
I'm usually okay. The last horror movie that I couldn't finish, and it was because I was alone at night and it was dark in my room, was Sinister. When I watched Sinister, I watched it in the morning when I woke up because I could not do it anymore. But I feel like I've gotten a lot better with maybe like what I'm afraid of.
Right.
And so the same things that were maybe scary in scary movies when I was 12 aren't scary anymore.
Have you seen Hereditary?
I haven't.
Oh, dude. There's okay. That's the last movie I watched. I watched it, I think it was last summer. I watched it last summer. It's on Prime actually. You can watch it. You can watch it now.
Right now?
No, not right now.
You want me to start it?
That movie, I started watching that movie at like midnight because I was not tired at all.
Bad news.
And I was so bored. I was like, ooh, Hereditary. Ari Aster, I've heard good things about him. He's, this movie's getting a ton of hype on YouTube and on Rotten Tomatoes, all that stuff. So I popped it on, and I got in about an hour in, and I said, fuck this.
He just couldn't do it anymore.
I shit you not. I turned all the lights on. I was living with my aunt at the time, and all my cousins were living in the house over the summer too, so I slept in the basement, like in the living room of the basement. And I don't know why this is, but whenever I sleep in like a bigger room, I get more scared. Like I feel like there's just more things that could happen inside a large space than in a small. Like when I'm in a bedroom, I'm like, the doors are locked. Like I know the closet is empty. I know there's nothing under the bed. But when I'm in a big giant room, I'm like, I can't check all these corners.
That's like the more grown-up version of hiding under the covers.
Literally, yeah.
You feel safe when you're enclosed.
Dude, I kid you not. I turned all the lights on, every single light in the basement that was available for me to turn on. I turned on. I shut all the blinds. I closed I closed everything up.
Yeah.
And I just laid there, just staring at the ceiling, like at least I have the lights on, because I was just sitting there like, oh my god, this is so bad.
It's kind of a classic like growing up thing. You see once the light goes off, you see a silhouette on your wall, and it's like a jacket hanging on a dresser post or whatever it is.
Right.
And it makes you think of it's a monster, right?
True. Yeah.
You know that part in The Babadook where the monster comes out of the door, like it's like a coat hanging on the door.
Yeah.
And she sees that and it comes out of that space. After I watched that, and I probably watched that the first time my senior year of high school, maybe junior year.
I watched it my senior year.
For the next few days, every time I went to sleep, I would turn and look at something, and I would think that there was like somebody standing in the door.
Oh, man.
And it's
I don't like that.
horror still has that effect sometimes. It depends on what I'm watching.
100%. Do you remember what the first movie you watched, the first horror movie you watched was, where you realized, oh, this is still scaring me, but I think I get now why why this is such a beloved genre by a kind of a niche group, really. And that's kind of what we'll kind of dive into that in a minute. But do you remember what movie it was where you actually sat down and where you were watching it and you went, oh, I get it. I get this now, and it kind of lended you to see more?
I think it probably was, and it's what's crazy is I can't really go into a whole lot of detail because I don't know that I remember every detail of this movie.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was Children of the Corn.
Okay.
When I saw that, I kind of realized what horror could be in terms of storytelling. And that was right at the beginning. Maybe it was influential to me because that was right at the beginning of my like horror movie kick. When my first year of college, that summer, I was just watching horror movies every single chance that I got.
Mm-hmm.
And although it might not stick out amongst the crowd, like that's the one that comes to mind when you ask me about realizing kind of the potential that horror had. And previous to that, I had seen The Shining, which it took me more than once to be like, oh, this is great, like truly great. Of course, I saw Psycho, and at first I was like, this isn't horror, this is not scary. But it's those kinds of movies that I have come to appreciate later on.
Right.
At first viewing, I didn't necessarily see it. It's something that I've had to kind of mature in my movie knowledge and kind of understanding of what makes a horror movie truly scary or truly unnerving. You know?
Right. I think for me, when I was when I was a kid, when I was a little younger, I watched Alien for the first time. But I was still a little too young to kind of understand what I was watching. It just scared the shit out of me, and I was like, I'm never watching that again. It's too scary. Yeah. I don't like this. And the same thing kind of happened with The Shining. Less so because I find The Shining, personally, I find The Shining a little less scary and just a little more just extremely unnerving. Which is fearful in its own right. But I watched both of those when I think I was a little too young, and I still was a little afraid to kind of let the fear in, as it were, and kind of experience what a horror film could let me experience, basically.
Right.
It wasn't till I was a freshman in college and I watched The Conjuring when I came home for fall break. So it was in October. It was the middle of October, so everyone was in the a Halloween mood. We were going to Halloween parties.
Of course.
So one night, all the friends got together and we watched The Conjuring, and I had never seen The Conjuring before, and it had been out for a couple years at that point. And personally, for me, one of the scariest movies I've ever seen, because it was the first time I really went, okay, I think I understand what's happening here. I think I can, so I paid attention. I actually watched the entire runtime of a movie and went, I'm gonna try and decipher why I'm so intrigued by this.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I watched a horror film and went, I want to see more.
I think
and it was weird. It was really weird.
I think for me, maybe why it took me so long to really get into the genre and kind of accept it as really a staple in film is that for the longest time, I saw horror movies as that they were only there to scare you. That the whole purpose of watching a horror movie was to make you scared.
Right.
Of course, I didn't really, at the time, maybe even understand how that could work on so many deeper levels than just jump scares, which of course we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize the way that it could truly, I guess I didn't realize its artistic potential.
Yeah,
and
I know what you're saying.
And I think that there's a lot of people that kind of write off horror as it's just for Halloween time, or it's like if you watch a horror movie, there's no good story. It's just because you want to get scared, or
right.
you want to jump, or maybe some people think that they're too predictable, or whatever it is. I understand why we kind of get those negative tropes,
right,
and that idea of kind of horror's limitations, but I think it's so much more than that.
I think it's kind of this ongoing preconceived notion that horror's had for years now, that cheap scares, sometimes it's just gory nothingness. And actually one of the movies we're going to talk about, The Thing, when it was originally released, it was panned. Critics hated that movie because they just thought it was just some gore fest, and they weren't able to kind of see past this kind of issue at hand, which was when in the early 80s nothing had been released that was like The Thing, because of how bloody it was and how kind of just brutal it was to its characters. I think that's a huge problem with horror today, is that, and this has been a problem since, forever ago, probably since after Hitchcock kind of got out of the game, is horror movies are initially so poorly received, a lot of them are, that it takes years and years and years for people to kind of go back to it and realize what they weren't quite getting, or what they were missing out on, some characterizations they didn't quite pick up. Roger Ebert's one of the best critics who's kind of been able to admit when he's wrong. Like he's really good at he's panned movies before, but then come back and reanalyze them 20 years later, and kind of looked more positively on them. And he's done that. He's done the reverse too. He gave The Graduate, one of my favorite movies, he gave that 4 out of 4 stars when it was originally released, and then he re-reviewed it and he was like, this is not as good as I remember it being. But I think in terms of how, compared to other genres, the horror genre, one of the biggest reasons why I think it's overlooked is because its initial reactions to it are always so either mixed or just bad. And I think it takes a lot longer for a style of film like horror to kind of appreciate it for what it's trying to do. I think it takes more time to kind of wrap your head around all the things it's trying to do, because humans inherently don't like thinking about what scares them.
Right.
That it's something, you just don't try to do with your everyday life. You don't think about what scares you, or you don't want to think about what makes you sad or afraid. So I think that kind of ties into criticism of horror. I think a lot of initial poor reaction, or just kind of mixed reception, a lot of it oftentimes comes from people just not wanting to be vulnerable just within themselves, and look at what it is that could potentially be scaring them in the story that they're kind of seeing unfold.
I think that's the key. You have to be able to be open to that uncomfortable reflection. And fear is something that everybody can relate to in one way or another. That doesn't mean that we're all afraid of the same things.
Right.
But fear is a common emotion for every single, I would argue, every single living creature. It's primal. It's something that we want to avoid because it is a kind of a warning signal to some degree.
Right.
And good horror movies can recreate that sort of tension and that kind of that battle almost within your own mind of not wanting to look away, but also realizing that you're afraid and you want to get out of that situation. But a big part of it is that horror has always pushed boundaries. Always. It's you mentioned with The Thing. It's also, dating back, you mentioned Hitchcock. It's going back to Psycho.
When did Psycho come out? Was it 1960?
I think it was 1960.
Yeah, so.
But But horror has always been a genre that's willing to, first of all, make the viewer uncomfortable, but also show you things on screen that typically audiences don't want to see. Now, as we've kind of progressed as a society, whether this is good or bad, we kind of have become more drawn to the violence and the gore and just overall the macabre. But horror makes people uncomfortable in a way that other film genres don't and really can't do within their own limitations.
Right. I think the only thing that really comes close is probably thrillers, but thrillers kind of bleed into the horror genre a little bit.
Yeah.
I think the why horror is so overlooked is kind of a two-sided sword in that while for the most part I think that criticism of that the idea that it's cheap, that it goes for easy scares, I think that's wrong, because usually they get that wrong with horror films that aren't just going for that. Critics can get that wrong with horror films that are actually doing a really good job of highlighting something that's frightening, right? Like in The Thing. The Thing is so good because it highlights so many primal fears, like freezing to death. That's a huge thing that plays out in that movie. Everyone is cold the entire time. They're in like a legitimate kind of like ice house of just contained cold, and there's no way to leave. That's such a primal, like something that just would irk me, The idea of freezing to death in the middle of nowhere in Antarctica, that's like it can't get much worse than that.
Yeah.
Right? So, well, I think like I said, I think part of it is critics just kind of misreading what they're seeing, only targeting the blood or the violence or the gore, and not really looking underneath and really trying to look at the subtext or the ideas that the story itself is trying to cover.
Yeah.
There also is a huge problem in that there are a lot of shitty horror movies out there, especially now.
Yeah.
I think in the past it was a little bit harder to get a horror movie funded, and people never wanted to throw money into it at all. Mm-hmm. Like if you didn't have the money for a actual studio, from an actual studio, you were making like Z movies, basically, right? Movies with a $10,000 budget that were just really campy, and people kind of recognize that. Nowadays, studios have realized they can throw $5 million at a movie, at a horror film, and no matter what, it will make at least double, triple, quadruple. It'll make 10 times its budget, a $5 million budget. You know how easy it is to cover a $5 million budget with a horror movie? Because, and this is another layer on top of this, people are okay going to see horror movies with cheap scares.
Yeah.
They're okay going to see it. They're okay with going to see a movie that's just a bunch of jump scares and then one person dies every 40 minutes. And that's not necessarily saying that someone dying is what makes something scary. But
that doesn't make horror.
Right, exactly. That's not what makes horror. What makes horror isn't, someone turning a light on and a loud noise and a jump scare.
Yeah.
That's not what makes horror. The problem is studios have kind of jumped on the train of realizing that you can get a minimal budget, B-list actors, you can have cheap scares, horrible editing, a director that's new into the game, and you can turn a profit. So it becomes this two-edged sword, because while I think a lot of times critics are wrong, most of the time they're right. And I think that kind of has because there are an increasing number of movies that are just kind of cheaply made and shitty when it comes to horror genre, it kind of overflows into movies that are actually much better than they're realizing, because it's just hard to get out of that lens of, oh, I'm actually watching something worthwhile. I'm actually watching something that is targeting real fear.
I mean, if we keep, and this is the collective we, keep throwing our money at these studios for making these shitty horror movies, it's going to only encourage them to continue making shitty horror movies. And you're right. that's why we get, for example, we get The Conjuring, and eventually that leads to like The Nun and just these awful movies, because they're looking for ways to make money, and trust me, they are making money.
Oh yeah, they're making a ton of money.
When you were younger, did you read like horror novels? Did you read like Stephen King? Or because for me, the extent of my like scary book readings is like the Goosebumps stories, and it was like I never really looked past that. Film was my introduction to Stephen King, and I mean, he's easily the most recognizable. His characters, his films, especially lately, with like Netflix picking up a bunch of them,
and the It duology that just came out over the past couple years. Exactly,
but I think part of it is a lot of our generation, at least we are kind of the last generation who is really exposed to these stories and know what makes a good story also scary, right? Because the It books are widely praised as, terrific horror novels.
Oh yeah, a lot of Stephen King stories are like that. Yeah,
and when it comes to like The Shining and getting paired with a director like Kubrick, and I feel like nowadays people aren't necessarily so familiar with the stories, and they're not necessarily looking for the stories. They're looking to sit down in a dark theater and jump a few times, and if they're scared while they're watching it, they got enough. And it's become a problem. And I know you also wanted to touch on this, so I'll maybe bring us into this next point, is horror movies and scary movies have basically altogether been forgotten in the awards shows.
Oh yeah.
And when it comes to, so here's a stat that I picked up from.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Why'd you do that?
I don't know.
Here's a stat that I picked up from theringer.com.
Okay.
And it kind of goes to what you were talking to me before we started recording. A horror film has only been nominated for Best Picture. They're out of a possible 546 nominees, okay, in the 90-year history of the Academy Awards. How many times do you think a horror movie has been nominated for Best Picture?
Man, it can't be more. It can't be more. Six times. I was gonna say you could probably count it on a hand or two.
And they're all, classics: The Exorcist, Jaws, Silence of the Lambs, The Sixth Sense.
Yep.
Black Swan. The most recent is Get Out.
Wow, The Sixth Sense got
a nomination.
Nice. That's a great horror movie.
But think about that.
But that's
Six
that's
out
not
of 546 possible.
Right. That is so one thing I never really thought about horror being not included in the award scene, because really for the most part ever since high school I just kind of realized that award shows, especially with movies and television and music, are overall just kind of sucky. They're not very good. They are the worst example of trying to be objective, and I could talk for days about that. But it wasn't until I watched Hereditary and Toni Collette, who's also actually in The Sixth Sense. Her role in Hereditary was just, oh my gosh, it was the most effective lead role from a female actor I had seen in all of 2019 by a long shot, or 2018. I think it was 2018 by a lot. And in 2018, I was still in college in 2018, so I was going to the theater every week, usually twice a week for a full year. When I wrote for the newspaper at the school, that's all I did. I just wrote reviews for them. So I'd seen a lot of movies that year, and I thought, man, I cannot believe she didn't get anything. She saw zero recognition for that role. And we've talked about how critics and fans can influence, why horror might be overlooked. But I don't know what about horror is overlooked in the sense that it just gets ignored. Those things get ignored. I don't really have that. I can't figure that out. It's something that I can't quite understand, because not only are there great performances in horror, but like you just watched The Descent. It's one of the movies we're going to talk about. Some of the directing, the use of color in that film, how it influences, like there is absolutely zero recognition for how well, even on the technical side, horror films are made. Like horror films in general just get such little attention, and I think the best reasoning I have so far is just that it's because everyone thinks it's just a cheap genre. It's a genre that goes for cheap thrills, and that's it.
For one reason or another, there is a disconnect between the audience, between the studios, between the critics, and like you said, between even the award shows. And we have to understand that all of those things influence each other in one way or another. Right. And it seems like with horror especially, that disconnect and the gap between critical success and audience success is so much greater than most other films. And I think part of it is it's harder to pick out what is a good horror movie. I'm glad
to other genres, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm glad that you brought up like the technical side of it, though. That's actually one of the notes that I had written down for this specifically was I feel like horror, just generally speaking, is so underrated in terms of cinematography, in terms of lighting and color and camera angles and
special effects, costume design.
Exactly, yeah. The few horror movies that we get where maybe the monster or whatever it is you're afraid of is not seen. Have you watched It Follows?
Yes, I have.
So It Follows is, widely praised for its cinematography and the way that it shoots each scene to make you feel like you don't know what is behind the camera and only showing you exactly what you need to be shown. Yeah. But you're right, that those kinds of creative choices kind of go unnoticed because of the genre that they're in.
Right. I think another thing I see going, one of the problems is it goes unnoticed until it's too late. Right. Like with a bunch of horror, like great horror films that came out in the 70s and 80s, like costume design and makeup and special effects, the way that that people actually made these scary things look real, like seem grounded in reality. It seems like almost like it was so underappreciated for so long that when CGI became a thing, it just was the decision to make for most horror creators, because they knew that all the work, all the money that would go into something like that wouldn't be valued enough. So it's just easier to create a computer-generated image that you can do without having to create or design anything.
And I think it's a lot easier to create those sort of unrealistic fears, I guess, when you have that kind of technology. Right. And I think part of the reason why that's excused is because, like I mentioned before, like fear is so relatable, even if what you are afraid of is unrealistic, that they can kind of get away with being a bit lazy in some regards. Right. Because of how easy we truly are scared, how easy it is to scare human beings.
But are we really getting scared? And that's what we're going to get into in the next episode. I think this is good. Yeah, this is a good jump off point. I think we both agree that, there are a lot of things that go overlooked when it comes to horror. But there's also a lot of problems that the genre has created for itself, which makes I think it makes it hard for fans and critics to kind of overlook that, which as someone who is so new to the love of the genre, it kind of sucks to see.
Yeah.
But I think the conversation we're going to have out here in the next couple days about jump scares, I'm really excited to talk about that because I think it's probably one of the biggest problems with the genre.
Yeah, if not the biggest, and of course we'll get into it. But of course. Man, I agree with you. It kind of sucks being so new to to horror and kind of loving the genre that it sucks because I look back in all of the best horror movies, all of the classics really it seems like that was a peak. In some ways more than others, but I feel like there's so much more room for improvement.
Well, there's also so much hope too. I mean, have you heard of Mike Flanagan?
A time or two.
Yeah, I know you have.
He deserves his own pod, honestly.
Dude, I would love to hear. We'll love to hear.
We'll do that one day. We'll break down Flanagan.
Yeah, I'm down for that. All right, you wanna take us out? Give us a little outro. Yeah.
So hopefully everybody's looking forward to our next discussion. We're gonna talk about why jump scares are not scary. Today is just really the start of our horror discussions. Leading up to Halloween, we've got all kinds of things coming. So if you like what you're hearing, what you're seeing, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. Leave us some reviews, some comments, some 5 stars, some thumbs up. Hopefully no thumbs down. But if you disagree with us, let us know. We want to hear from everybody.
We'd love to hear it. Leave us some comments. You know, we got one comment on a video, and it was positive, and I was almost disappointed because I wanted someone to just be like, "This sucks," so I could go, "Hey, like, why do we suck?" Just to have the conversation. Because when you go, "Hey, you guys, I love your stuff," and not that I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your comment that you love the show. I really do appreciate it. But when someone says, "I love the show," you're like, "Oh, thank you," and then it ends. Like, I'm not gonna say, "Well, what did you love about it?" Because I don't know.
It's a little self-absorbed.
It's like it's so weird. Like, what did you love about me? Like, I'm not gonna.
No, but I mean, truly, we do want to know what people want to see, what we could do better. Of course,
we'd love to know
this is a work in progress.
Absolutely.
We have a long way to go, but we hope that we can kind of keep pushing out content that we're happy with, that the people are happy with.
100%.
And we're not stopping anytime soon. So
I hope not. All right, man. See you guys next time. Boom. Don't what?
I already took my mic off.